Jason and Craig Cox weren't just brothers. They were trusted members of one of Liverpool's most dangerous crime gangs. But in 2020, they pulled off a daring heist that would shatter their own world, stealing 1.2 million's worth of cocaine from their own gang's stash house. What happened next was a tale of betrayal, greed, and a fallout that would change everything. Jason Cox was 38 years old, and his younger brother Craig was 35 when they made the kind of decision that would not only destroy their ties to a powerful Liverpool-based crime group, but also land them behind bars for years. These weren't two young men dragged into crime by chance. From early on, both had been surrounded by a culture that normalized drugs, money, and violence. Their older brother, Lee Cox, was already embedded in the local criminal scene, known as someone who could get things moved quietly and efficiently. Together, the three brothers were more than just family. They were business partners in an underworld where trust was rare and betrayal could be deadly. By 2020, the Cox brothers had become familiar faces in the Liverpool drug trade. They weren't street-level dealers. They operated higher up the chain, dealing in bulk shipments of cocaine and managing a network of couriers, stash houses, and distributors. Their operations were well organized and disciplined. They knew the risks, years in prison, or worse, but the rewards were too big to walk away from. They lived well, drove expensive cars, and carried themselves like men who didn't have to worry about money. But under the surface, things weren't as stable as they appeared. Despite working for a powerful gang that valued loyalty above all else, Jason and Craig began to grow restless. The more they saw, the more they realized how fragile the whole operation was. A stash house left unguarded, a courier who talked too much, a middleman with drug debts. It didn't take long for the idea to form. What if they took the product themselves? Not a small quantity. Everything. Enough cocaine to change their lives forever. Nearly 30 kilograms, worth over £1.2 million. It would be the kind of haul most criminals could only dream of. The only catch: the drugs belonged to their own gang. What made the Cox brothers dangerous wasn't just their access or ambition, it was their silence. No one suspected what they were planning. There were no warning signs, no arguments, no threats, just two brothers smiling and playing their part until the moment was right. In the underworld, loyalty is currency. But for Jason and Craig, greed was more powerful than loyalty, and they were about to prove it. The stash house was nothing special from the outside, just another semi-detached property on a quiet residential street in Liverpool. There were no flashy cars out front, no suspicious characters hanging around, and no sign that it held anything more than old furniture or forgotten junk. But inside, hidden behind false walls and under floorboards, were packages worth millions. This particular stash house was used by the gang to store high-purity cocaine before it was broken down, cut, and distributed across the region. It was one of several safe locations the organization relied on to keep the product moving without attracting attention. Jason and Craig Cox knew the location well. They had been involved in setting it up, organizing the deliveries, and monitoring the quantities held inside. It was meant to be one of the most secure points in the operation. Only a handful of trusted individuals had access, mostly senior figures, long-time couriers, and men with proven loyalty. The brothers were among them, with full clearance to enter and exit as needed. No one questioned their presence there. That trust would turn out to be the gang's biggest mistake. In early 2020, a major delivery came in, almost 30 kilograms of cocaine, pure and ready to be processed. The shipment had come from a European supplier and was worth around 1.2 million on the street. It was stored in the stash house, scheduled for cutting and redistribution over the coming days. Everything was going according to plan. The crew was confident. The operation was smooth and no one suspected anything was about to go wrong. But Jason and Craig had been paying attention to more than just the delivery schedule. They had watched the routines closely. Who came and went when the house was checked, how long it was left unattended. They noted weaknesses in security and gaps in oversight. Most importantly, they had access, not just physical access, but insider knowledge. They knew how to get in without leaving a trace. They knew which cameras were fake and which doors were left unlocked too often. The plan wasn't rushed. It was carefully built over weeks. The gang trusted the Cox brothers completely. That trust gave them all the information they needed to steal everything and walk away without anyone realizing what had happened until it was far too late. The theft didn't look like a robbery. There were no smashed windows, no forced doors, no signs of a break-in. When the gang's men arrived at the stash house the next morning, everything looked exactly as it should until they opened the concealed storage space. The 30 kilograms of cocaine were gone. Not a single package remained. For a few seconds, no one spoke. It didn't make sense. The place had been locked. The alarms hadn't gone off. There was no sign of police involvement. It was as if the drugs had simply vanished into thin air. Panic set in almost immediately. The value of the missing cocaine was enormous, enough to fund months of operations and pay off multiple suppliers. The loss didn't just hurt the gang financially, it put them at serious risk. Failing to deliver on promised deals could lead to violent retaliation from other criminal groups. The men at the scene began calling higher-ups, who arrived quickly and launched their own internal investigation. They assumed it had to be a targeted job by outsiders, another gang maybe, or rogue police officers. But the longer they searched, the more it became clear whoever had taken the cocaine knew exactly what they were doing. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no unusual activity picked up on nearby CCTV. Whoever had taken the stash had used a key or knew where the spare was hidden. They had entered quietly, moved quickly, and left no trace. The operation had the hallmarks of an inside job, but no one wanted to believe that. Loyalty in the gang was considered unbreakable, especially among the core group, yet the facts didn't lie. As questions flew and suspicion began to spread, Jason and Craig Cox kept their heads down. They didn't skip town immediately. They stayed just long enough to act surprised, frustrated, and concerned. They asked the right questions, appeared at meetings, and even offered suggestions on who might be responsible. It was a performance, and they played it perfectly. The timing of their eventual disappearance would be subtle, delayed just enough to avoid immediate blame. By the time the gang realized they'd been betrayed from within, the Cox brothers were already long gone, and the drugs had likely been moved, sold, or repackaged. The perfect crime had been committed in silence, and no one had seen it coming. Days turned into weeks, and the missing cocaine remained unaccounted for. The gang's top figures were growing more desperate by the hour. What started as quiet inquiries quickly turned into aggressive interrogations. Low-level runners were pulled aside and questioned. Whispers of suspicion turned into shouting matches behind closed doors. Every man who had ever stepped foot in the stash house was considered a suspect. Some were beaten, others were threatened, but no one cracked. Everyone swore they knew nothing. And for the most part, they didn't. Jason and Craig Cox had been careful. They hadn't involved anyone else. They hadn't bragged or confided in friends. They hadn't even told their older brother Lee until after the job was done. Their silence protected them more than any weapon ever could. While chaos unfolded inside the gang, the brothers maintained a low profile. They didn't vanish right away. That would have looked suspicious. Instead, they gradually faded out, answering fewer calls, avoiding meetings, keeping their distance. When questioned, they claimed to be staying low because of unrelated police heat. It was believable. The authorities had been more active lately, and several other gang associates had recently been arrested in a separate investigation. The excuse gave the brothers just enough cover to avoid attention, at least temporarily. But not everyone was convinced. The first real red flag came when a mid-level associate spotted Craig driving a new car, a high-performance German vehicle bought in cash. Soon after, Jason was seen in a luxury watch shop, looking at models worth tens of thousands. For men supposedly keeping a low profile, they were living dangerously loud. Word began to spread. People started doing the math. Two brothers known to have access to the stash house. Two brothers suddenly flush with money. Two brothers now rarely seen in the usual circles. suspicion shifted quickly, and once it did, it spread like wildfire. But without solid proof, the gang couldn't act. If they were wrong, taking revenge on the wrong men could fracture the crew even further. Still, the pressure was building. Every day the missing cocaine remained unaccounted for. The leadership looked weaker, and the Cox brothers, once trusted insiders, were now the unspoken threat nobody dared to name, at least not yet. Jason and Craig Cox had pulled off the kind of theft that most criminals wouldn't dare to attempt, robbing their own gang of 1.2 million's worth of cocaine. But instead of disappearing into the shadows, they made one critical error. They got greedy, and they got loud. Within weeks of the heist, their lifestyle began to change in ways that didn't go unnoticed. Expensive watches, designer clothes, high-end electronics, and cars bought with straight cash, none of it matched the income they were known to have. Even in the criminal underworld, sudden wealth raises eyebrows. The pair started spending money in a way that drew attention, not just from the gang they'd betrayed, but from other criminal networks as well. In Liverpool, people talked. Rumors spread fast, and soon everyone from rival crews to local dealers was speculating about how the brothers had come into so much cash so quickly. Some believed they'd pulled off a robbery, others thought they had found a new supplier and gone solo. A few started whispering the unthinkable, that they'd taken the gang's stash for themselves. The more they spent, the more isolated they became. Friends who once welcomed them began keeping their distance. Associates refused to meet in public. No one wanted to be seen with two men who were either stupidly reckless or sitting on stolen product. But the brothers didn't slow down, whether it was arrogance, denial, or a desperate attempt to launder the money as quickly as possible. They kept spending. Behind the scenes, their older brother Lee was working hard to keep things from falling apart. A long-time operator in the drug trade, Lee had connections across the supply chain. He was known as calm, smart, and disciplined. Everything his younger brothers were not. But now he found himself dragged into a storm of suspicion. Surveillance teams spotted him meeting with potential buyers. Financial records showed large sums moving through businesses tied to him. Whether he had known about the theft from the start, or simply helped clean up afterwards, no longer mattered. The damage was done. Jason and Craig had not only burned their own bridges, but they had dragged their older brother into the fire with them. What had started as the perfect heist was now turning into a ticking time bomb, with pressure mounting from every direction: gangs, police, and even those once closest to them. Lee Cox had always kept himself one step removed from the chaos of street-level crime. While Jason and Craig handled the movement of drugs and dealt with risky face-to-face transactions, Lee operated from the background. He managed the logistics, organizing couriers, managing safe houses, and moving money through a network of fronts. He understood how to make things look clean, how to stay invisible. For years, that separation had kept him off law enforcement's radar. But after the stash house theft, that protective distance began to disappear. At first, Lee tried to maintain control. He wasn't directly involved in the robbery, but as the investigation into the missing cocaine intensified, his name started appearing more frequently. His brothers' sudden spending sprees made it clear they had access to large amounts of untraceable cash, and Lee was seen helping move some of it. Transactions were quietly processed through businesses he was connected to, and encrypted messages tied him to conversations cracked. In early 2020, French and Dutch police managed to infiltrate the supposedly secure communication platform used by thousands of criminals across Europe. The breakthrough was massive, and the UK's National Crime Agency was among the first to gain access to the data. Jason, Craig, and Lee Cox were all users of EncroChat. They relied on it to coordinate deals, plan shipments, and arrange payments. The brothers assumed it was untouchable. They shared drop-off locations, discussed drug purity levels, and even complained about unreliable couriers, all in what they thought was a secure environment. But now, investigators had it all. The messages were damning, especially when matched with CCTV footage, bank transfers, and mobile location data. In one series of messages, Jason described offloading bricks that matched the weight of the stolen stash. Craig bragged about finding new buyers willing to pay premium prices. Lee talked in vague terms about clearing out old stock and making room for more. But when pieced together, the pattern was obvious. The timeline matched the stash house theft. The language, while coded, was clear enough for investigators to understand. As surveillance teams monitored their movements, the brothers became increasingly paranoid. They changed phones frequently and moved locations often. But they didn't know they were already being tracked. Everything, calls, meetings, deliveries, was under observation. Hidden cameras caught them meeting known dealers. Financial investigators traced the flow of money from drug sales into luxury purchases and shell companies. The gang they stole from wasn't blind to the growing evidence either. Word spread fast that the Cox brothers were being watched. In the criminal world, police attention is contagious. Anyone seen associating with them risked exposure. As a result, former allies began cutting ties. The brothers, once protected by reputation and family connections, were now isolated. They hadn't just stolen from a gang, they'd triggered a full-scale investigation that was closing in fast, and they had no idea just how much the authorities already knew. In late 2020, the carefully constructed world the Cox brothers had built began to collapse. After months of surveillance, intercepted communications, and gathering evidence, the National Crime Agency and Merseyside Police moved in with a coordinated series of raids. Jason, Craig and Lee were caught off guard despite their efforts to stay hidden. At their homes and known meeting places, officers seized drugs, burner phones, large sums of cash, and encrypted devices containing the digital proof the brothers had hoped would remain secret. The arrest sent shockwaves through Liverpool's criminal community. The Cox brothers, once untouchable within their gang, were now public enemies. Their downfall was not only about the stolen cocaine, but also the wider conspiracy of drug supply, money laundering and betrayal. The stolen cocaine itself was never recovered, suggesting it had already been sold off or moved out of the country. But that did little to lessen the strength of the case against them. Financial investigators traced large purchases, including luxury cars and expensive property, back to unexplained income linked to the theft. The brothers had spent tens of thousands of pounds trying to enjoy their newfound wealth, but every transaction left a digital footprint. The authorities built a clear picture. The Cox brothers weren't just petty thieves, they were running a well-organized and profitable criminal enterprise. In court, prosecutors detailed the theft from the stash house, the subsequent distribution of the stolen drugs, and the laundering of profits through a web of businesses and personal accounts. They painted a picture of betrayal so deep it shocked even hardened criminal observers. The brothers had stolen from their own gang, risking deadly retaliation and fracturing a tightly controlled operation. Lee Cox's role, while less direct, was no less significant. Evidence showed he had helped move the stolen drugs and manage their sale. His involvement proved that the theft wasn't a rogue act, but part of a family plan to seize control and profit at the expense of those they once called allies. The arrests marked the beginning of the end for the Cox brothers. The law had caught up with their ambition, their empire was crumbling. The gang they'd betrayed was left to pick up the pieces, but the damage was done. The perfect crime had become a perfect downfall. The courtroom was packed when the verdict was announced. Jason and Craig Cox sat with their heads down, knowing the evidence against them was overwhelming. The judge laid out the charges clearly: conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, robbery and multiple offenses linked to the stolen cocaine and its distribution. The brothers had not only stolen a vast quantity of cocaine from their own gang, but had also profited from selling it. Their betrayal cut deep into the criminal world's code of loyalty, making their crimes all the more serious in the eyes of the law. Jason and Craig were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, reflecting the scale and impact of their crimes. The judge emphasized that stealing from one's own gang was a serious breach of trust that endangered lives and destabilized the criminal network. The sentence was a warning to others who might consider similar acts of treachery. Lee Cox, though less directly involved in the theft, was also sentenced for his part in facilitating the supply and laundering the proceeds. His role in managing the logistics and helping move the stolen drugs made him complicit in the crime, and the court did not spare him. Alongside prison sentences, the court issued a financial order under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Jason and Craig were ordered to repay $80,226. The amount investigators could definitively link to their illegal earnings from the stolen cocaine. If they failed to repay this sum, they faced additional prison time. This order was designed to strip criminals of the benefits of their crimes and act as a deterrent against profiting from illegal activity. The sentences sent ripples through Liverpool's criminal circles. The Cox brothers' fall was a powerful reminder that no one was above the law, no matter their connections or reputation. It also highlighted the growing effectiveness of law enforcement in tackling organized crime through intelligence, technology, and financial investigation. For the Cox family, the consequences were devastating. A close-knit group torn apart by greed and betrayal, their actions had not only led to imprisonment but had left lasting scars within the community and their own family. The brothers' ambition to take control had instead brought destruction, both personally and professionally. The courtroom drama ended, but the story of the Cox brothers remained a cautionary tale about loyalty, power, the high price of betrayal. The fallout from the Cox brothers' crimes continued long after the courtroom doors closed. Liverpool's organized crime scene was shaken to its core. The gang they had betrayed had been forced to tighten control, restructure leadership, and rebuild trust with suppliers and buyers. The loss of 30 kilograms of high-purity cocaine was a severe financial blow, but the damage went far deeper. The theft exposed vulnerabilities in the gang's operations, and raised questions about loyalty that lingered for years. For Jason, Craig, and Lee Cox, prison was more than just a punishment. It was a long period of reflection and isolation. Inside, the brothers faced the reality of their choices. Their once powerful status had been stripped away, replaced by the harsh routine of incarceration. Prison life was dangerous, especially for men known for betrayal. They had to navigate threats from other inmates and stay alert to the risk of gang retaliation behind bars. The brotherhood that had once been their strength now became a source of constant tension and danger. Outside, law enforcement agencies continued to monitor the ripple effects of the Cox case. The success of cracking EncroChat had opened new doors for tackling organized crime, allowing police to intercept conversations, map criminal networks, and prevent similar large-scale thefts. The case became a textbook example for investigators, prosecutors, and judges on how to use technology and financial tracking to dismantle criminal empires. Meanwhile, in the local community, the Cox family name carried a heavy burden. Families connected to the gang faced scrutiny, and trust between neighbors was fragile. Some saw the brothers as cautionary figures, proof that even those closest to power could fall. Others felt anger at the destruction the theft had caused, not just financially, but in the fear and instability it brought to the streets. The story of the Liverpool brothers was a stark reminder that crime rarely pays in the long run. Ambition and greed had led to a dramatic downfall, with consequences felt far beyond the prison walls. For Jason, Craig, and Lee Cox, their legacy would forever be tied to the heist that shook a city, shattered a gang, and ended 3 lives of crime behind bars. The true cost of betrayal had finally been paid, and it